Welcome T1D community. Have you ever been embarrassed, felt uncomfortable, or unfortunately, have you ever been harassed or discriminated against as you were trying to have a fun night out? Perhaps go to a concert, attend your favorite sporting event, or you weren't allowed to board a flight because personnel isn't familiar with type 1 diabetes and our medical devices. I bet we all have a story, right? Welcome to Universally Read. Today, we have a special guest, Daniel Phelan from Type 1 Action. Listen to this very enlightening interview as my daughter Sophia asks important questions regarding our rights as Type 1 diabetics. Questions like, should I tell my potential employer that I have Type 1 diabetes during my interview? Are private schools and camps required to pay for Type 1 accommodations? And details involving school 504 plans are all thoroughly discussed and more. And here, Mr. Phelan share a heartbreaking story of discrimination that ultimately paved the way for federal laws being passed. All questions are time-stamped in the description box below. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up and please subscribe to Universally Read. Thank you for watching.
Hi, my name is Sophia Salshutz and I'm here with Daniel Phelan. Thank you so much for being here today. I know you have a really busy schedule, so thanks for squeezing me in.
I'm happy to be here.
So we would love to get to know you, so we're just going to go right in and start on with the questions. So when were you diagnosed with type 1 diabetes?
So I was diagnosed in June of 2002, and so I just crossed my 20-year mark.
Oh, happy Dia birthday! I just crossed my 8-year in August, so yeah. So what was your motivation to become a lawyer and eventually start your foundation, Type 1 Action?
I became a lawyer actually after playing baseball. For some reason, I actually, it's funny, I actually liked the show Suits. I don't know if you know the show Suits. And I got interested in corporate law and stuff like that. I ended up going to law school. Right after I graduated, I started my foundation that is still going strong today. And so my foundation does work that's much different than what I do in my law career. So in my law career, I'm actually a litigator at a big firm in the city. And I do really mostly corporate litigation involving real estate companies and real estate assets and things like that. I do also do a little bit of like antitrust and trade regulation stuff, but my whole practice is really centered on litigation. My foundation, though, I started to help people with type 1 diabetes who are experiencing different legal issues or issues that involve civil rights and things like that that affect the type 1 diabetes community as well. And it's funny, I went through a few different ideas on how to, have my foundation work for the T1D community. And first, I started out by trying to represent people in different matters involving legal issues, mostly kids who are being denied access to accommodations in school. That's been like the big focus of the foundation for a while. We eventually got away from that because of a lot of different issues that we faced. One being that personally, I can only practice law in New York State. So we're kind of limited in helping people in even New Jersey and Connecticut, but also places like Florida, Texas, California, and all around the country. So that became an issue really early on when, especially I getting contacted by people in just right across in Jersey, right? So and then also me personally, I cannot really represent people outside of my firm. So there's a little bit of red tape there, but also we have a board of directors that is not all attorneys. So that raised issues as well. So because of that, what I started to do was make my foundation more of a resource for people rather than helping them one-on-one. So there have been matters that I've taken in the past as like a pro bono basis or if it got more involved, like a contingency fee basis. But for the most part, what we do is we provide resources to people with T1D around the country to help them navigate different issues. If it rises to a level of where they actually need legal representation, we've developed a good network of attorneys around the country, and we refer them out. And it's worked so far. It's been working well, actually.
That's so great. It's really something that's powerful to have in our community because I know a lot of people do face certain legal issues and sometimes they don't know who to talk to. So it's great that you're doing that and kind of like combining your career with something that's in your own life. So I find that really interesting.
I was going to say something you just said is actually what I found to be the biggest issue affecting the T1D community is not knowing your rights, right? So you're your greatest advocate, and that's always going to be the case, even in this area, right? So if you don't know what you're entitled to, whether it be in school, the workplace, at a camp, something like that, if you don't actually know what you're entitled to, two things can happen. You can either think that you're entitled to something that you might not be entitled to, and you may end up on bad terms with somebody where you could have actually worked something out easier, or you just don't know that you're entitled to something and you're missing out on participating in a camp or something like that because you were told you can't come there. So really, like, education has become one of the biggest aspects of my foundation. Like, getting information out there, whether it be by me speaking at different events around the country or, through the website or email blasts, things like that. Like, getting information out there has been, probably the biggest activity that we've started to take on over the past few years.
Yeah, I know you're talking about like in the workplace and whether it be in school or college, people need to know their rights. Can you kind of tell the audience some of their rights?
I guess we can talk about the three main areas that are important. So first one is schools, both public and private. Okay, so there's a few laws that affect these areas. So first of all, if you're a public school student, right, you're protected. If you have type 1 diabetes, you're mainly protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. And you'll hear the phrase 504 plan a lot. So that's where that comes from, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So those are the main two. Now, in different jurisdictions, there are other civil rights laws that may affect you, right? So if you're on Long Island, that would be like the New York State Human Rights Law. New York City has its own human rights law, which is one of the strongest in the country. So there might be different local laws that affect you as well. But for the purposes of this conversation, like, the main two are the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. So they really mirror each other, and what they do is they really say that you cannot discriminate against a person with a qualified disability on the basis of that disability. So type 1 diabetes is a qualified disability because it affects a major life function. So you're entitled to reasonable accommodations. So that's where you get into the weeds of what you're really entitled to. Okay. And the key word there is what's reasonable. So a good example that I like to use about, what's reasonable or not is, let's say you are a Fortune 100 company and you hire an employee who is wheelchair bound. Okay. You are going to be required to modify your facilities to accommodate that person in the wheelchair. That may be at a cost of millions of dollars. Let's say it's going to take $10 million to modify your facilities to accommodate that person. Okay. You're going to be required to as a company. Okay. That's not going to set you back. That's not going to cause you to go into bankruptcy or something like that. Okay. Now, let's say you are a small company. You have 20 employees, you have annual revenue of, let's say, $10 million. Your profits are, let's say, $1 million a year. Okay. And so you hire that employee and they require modifications to your facility that are going to cost you $8 million. Okay. You're not going to be required to do that because it would be unreasonable. It's going to put your books well into the red, might cause you to have to fire other employees, might cause you to lose all profits, things like that. So that's an easy way of describing what's reasonable. So the fortunate thing for type 1 diabetes is that most accommodations don't cost money. Okay. So if you think about it, right, what do you need at school or the workplace? You need access to food and drink at all times. You need access to the bathroom and the water fountain at all times. You might need some testing accommodations like stoppage time. And I'll get into some of the accommodations in a minute that you shouldn't have. But, most of the things that I'm describing right now are free. It's just allowing you to do something so that you can manage your diabetes safely and also participate in all school activities and receive your education. The benefit of the accommodations that affect people with type 1 diabetes are that they usually don't cost any money. They're really just allowing, in this instance, a student with type 1 diabetes to manage their diabetes while participating in school activities and receive their education. But there are certain things, such as having a one-on-one aid, that affect younger kids, and those will sometimes cost the school money. You would also be surprised at how many schools don't have a full-time nurse. So that is also a cost issue for schools as well. So if you're in a public school and they have an issue with a nurse, you may have to work with that school a little bit. I do know that over the past couple of years, there has been a serious nursing shortage, and that was kind of exacerbated by the pandemic. And even today, it's actually very difficult for a school to find a nurse right now. So if you don't have a full-time nurse, that may be something that you need to be aware of. But the one-on-one aid also, if you're a young first grader or second grader, right, at that point in time, you haven't developed the ability to like associate a feeling with a low or high blood sugar. So you really need somebody with you all the time, really until probably fourth or fifth grade that can read your Dexcom and contact the nurse if something's happening or give you snacks, right? So in a perfect world, that's what would happen. But again, if school doesn't have enough resources, that may be an issue. So I will say probably the most important accommodations for a student with type 1 diabetes in school to have are a one-on-one aid for a younger student until they're in probably fourth or fifth grade. Making sure there's a nurse in the building, that's another important one. You should have stoppage time on exams, not extra time. And this is like one of the most important distinctions to make when it comes to accommodations for students, because extra time runs out, stoppage time doesn't. Okay, so you may have extra time for maybe ADHD or something like that, but when it comes to type 1 diabetes, it may take 2 hours or more to correct a high blood sugar, or a low blood sugar might take 30 to 45 minutes to correct, right? And then you want to be in a comfortable state to go back and taking the exam. So if you only have 15 or 20 minutes of extra time and it's going to take you 45 minutes to correct the low, you're going to be taking that exam in a state of mind that you shouldn't be taking that exam in. So stoppage time is really the most important thing to have with respect to exams. And it's also important to have early on, because in New York State, once you start taking the regents, once you get to your college exams, such as the ACT and SAT, and then once you're in college and you're taking graduate exams too, if you go that route, they look at accommodations that you've had in the past. So if you have a whole history of accommodations, then you'll be able to show them, and it's going to be pushed right through usually. I will say myself, I did not ask for accommodations on any exam I ever took until I took the bar exam. So I had no idea. I didn't really know what to ask for. I was in a school district that was very accommodating to me. I grew up in Northport. And so I never had an issue. They always made sure that I was good. So really the bar exam was the very first time I ever asked for accommodations, which is crazy to think about. Other than that, I would say access to food and drink whenever you need, access to the bathroom and water fountain whenever you need. Again, these are without limitations. Access to the nurse's office whenever you need, again, without limitations. You should also not have any latenesses or absences that are a direct result of type 1 diabetes to be counted against you, right? So other students have X amount of absences and latenesses that they're allotted, right? You should not have issues that are directly related to your diabetes count against those. You should have those in addition to your absences for type 1 diabetes.
Yes, 100%. So I go to a public school in New York State, and I do actually have a 504 plan. I've had that pretty much since I was diagnosed. Yeah, and my 504 plan consists of kind of things you were saying, like having that break, having extra time if I need it. My school's very good about that. They give me plenty of time. Also, having my phone with me so I could check my Dexcom, even on state testing. Just there needs to be a proctor in the room, obviously, for obvious reasons.
That's another thing that's really important that you have. I'm happy you brought that up, because the phones for a while were I think they still are. They're a very contentious topic with schools,
Yeah. Yeah, especially with the new technology, with the Dexcoms and the Bluetooth and everything. So that needs to be near you. It has to be within a certain amount of feet for it to actually work. In addition, using the bathroom, and like you said, lateness. I remember one morning, I was high all night, I had ketones, something went wrong with my sight. My mom emailed my school nurse and said I would be running in late, and they didn't say anything about it. They still marked me like I was on time, so that's really good to know. I actually didn't know that, but now that I'm thinking back to that one incident, that did happen, so they did allot me that.
Okay, so I have a very interesting story to tell you. I represent a family, and I've been representing them now for about 6 years. So this should tell you how long, litigation takes. They first contacted my foundation, I think it was in the fall of 2017 was the first time they contacted me. So this was a matter that I ended up taking personally, and actually still represent them to this day in this litigation. So this family, they're at a school district on Long Island, and the son, and this is something that's completely common with kids in middle school, right? They start going through puberty and stuff. When those hormones increase, it has a serious effect on their blood sugar. Okay? So no fault to his own, he started having extremely high blood sugars. Was at the doctor regularly trying to take care of this, just had very, very, very high blood sugars all the time. And again, it happens like to a lot of people. So once this started, he started being late to school often. Okay. Now he was missing a lot of first period and some second period. And so his mom was letting the school know that they're working on the issue with the doctor. He's just having very high blood sugars. The nurse logs show this. I mean, we're talking blood sugars that were regularly in the 400s, high 300s, extremely high blood sugar, A1Cs well above 10, just very, very sick. And so what ends up happening is the school files a complaint or a petition or something with the Suffolk County Department of Probation. Okay. What this leads to then is a complaint being filed in Suffolk County Family Court accusing the child of being truant. Now, keep in mind, he was at school most days. He was missing the beginning of school. And keep in mind that every time he was at the nurse testing his blood sugar, very elevated. Okay. So he ends up having, before he contacted me, he had a court-appointed lawyer, like legal aid, who advised him to just plead guilty to the truancy accusation. And keep in mind, this isn't like necessarily criminal, so it's a much less formal process. I mean, I don't really do much in this area, but that's my understanding of it. It's a very, kind of informal hearing process. And so that's what he does. And the reason was because if he did that, he would be placed on 2 years of probation, and he would not have any risk of going to really what was a juvenile detention facility. Okay, so that was literally what was on the line for him. So he does this. He's placed on probation, and then proceeds to have his probation violated multiple times. So he was required at this point. Now, keep in mind, all this kid had was high blood sugars and was very sick all the time. Okay. He was checked on regularly by a probation officer then. He was required to be drug tested every other week. He was required to have a visit with the probation officer once a week. He was required to complete court-appointed counseling. He had a social worker assigned to him. The worst part was he had a 3 p.m. curfew on the weekdays, so he had to go right home from school. And I believe it was like a 5 or 7 p.m. curfew on the weekends. So that was his life. And he eventually has his probation violated multiple times. The first time, I believe, was when he had his phone at school, was told to put his phone away. He was using the phone to, kind of like he needed it on him, obviously. He needed to regularly like contact his mom. He was told to put the phone away. The probation officer ordered him not to bring his phone to school anymore. Now, think how detrimental that is for 2 weeks, him not being able to contact his mom while he's dealing with these issues, not being able to. So the mom told him, no, you need to bring your phone to school. Probation officer found out and violated his probation for that. That was the first violation. Eventually, there was another violation for him having his phone out in class. Okay, so after the incident with the first cell phone thing, that's when they contacted me. I advised them to go ahead and get his 504 plan modified, right, to allow him to have his cell phone in school. And 2 weeks before he was set to finish his probation, he was told in class that he could not have his phone. Now, keep in mind, this was months. Now, he was fine for months. And, conveniently, just 2 weeks before he was supposed to get off probation, he was told to put his phone away. He told the teacher, I don't have to, which he didn't. He was suspended for being insubordinate. And then that's what led directly to the litigation that is still going on to this day. He was just absolutely harassed by the school. He also was given detention for using the nurse's office too much. He was going to the nurse's office roughly 4 to 5 times a day to check his blood sugar, which again was always high, and take insulin, correct it, etc. what he was doing was he would leave class. When class was over, he would get to the nurse's office, test his blood sugar, take insulin if necessary, go to his locker, get his books, and go to class. And he was roughly, the assistant principal testified in a deposition that he was roughly 2 to 3 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes late to class. So think about all the stuff he had to do. Leave class, get to the nurse's office, test his blood sugar, take insulin, get to his locker, get his books, get to his next class. And he was only like 3 to 5 minutes late. And he was given a detention for abusing his privileges. So this is what, like, you know, this is what this poor kid has to deal with. So that is a matter that is still going on to this day. He's been out of high school now for 2 years. So that just shows you how lengthy litigation is.
Yeah. So you said this boy was in middle school, right?
He was in middle school when it started.
Wow. So I can only imagine being so young, because I know, like, when my blood sugar goes high, I do not feel good. And I can't imagine, like, being punished for, like, protecting my own health and going to see my doctor. That's like a fundamental human right. So that's crazy. I also I wanted to ask something, because I know I'm kind of about to go into college, and I've seen some questions on it on, like, my Common App. I know if you've been suspended from school or something, colleges want to know that. Did that necessarily affect him getting into college?
He did. He ended up not going to college.
Okay. Was that in his plans before, or was that necessarily? Okay.
We obviously hired experts and stuff like that, and psychological experts, and you know, like I mentioned before, I got involved in this area really with my foundation, and there were certain cases that I got more involved with, this being one of them. And this one was because I had the ability to change law, which it did, and I'll get to that in a second. But once we got the expert reports, they all said the same thing, that, like, as a result of this, he was severely depressed, doesn't have a good outlook on life. He developed hypertension and stuff while this was happening, because he knew that there was the possibility each time that he was, you know, if he got in any trouble, there was a possibility that he was going to be sent away to a juvenile detention facility. He almost did too, because the second time his probation was violated for having the phone in class, which again, his 504 plan specifically said that he was permitted to have this phone out. So what happened was, after they realized that, they changed the reasoning to insubordination. What they said to him was that even though his 504 plan says that, when a teacher tells him to do something, he has to do it. So he was sent to an alternative learning center, which is where he pretty much finished high school at. He was forced to go through a psychological evaluation. He was sent to a center that takes kids in who are delinquent in some manner or other. They do psychological tests, but they keep them there. It's like a live-in facility. It's not supposed to be like a punishment, but it's supposed to be like, you know, a psychological facility where he stays at. And their evaluation of him was that he doesn't have anything wrong. He just has diabetes. And I mean, this was literally like the place that he was sent to said this. So after that, he ended up finishing out his high school at like an alternative place. I think it was like a BOCES or something like that. And he went back to the school only a month before graduation just to graduate with his friends, but otherwise, like, couldn't go back to that place. He had to be homeschooled with like tutors and stuff because he just couldn't go to school. Like, he was, I mean, literally like developed heart issues because of all of this that was happening.
That's terrible. I think the bottom line is that there's a huge lack of education on this topic and on many other autoimmune diseases. And I think that it is very, very good what you guys are doing with your foundation to have these kind of resources and for people to know their rights and to kind of advocate for themselves and to contact a lawyer when they think it's necessary. So I think, wow, I can't even imagine doing that. I mean, I feel like so fortunate to have a school and have my 504 plan.
It's funny, when I look at when I was growing up, I didn't even have a 504 plan. Like, my school just did the right thing. You know, there were other kids with type 1 diabetes. It was just like they just did the right thing, you know? And it's like, it's crazy when you see something like this happening. It's insane to me. I think one of the big issues with type 1 diabetes especially is that there is sometimes a stigma associated with it. And that's because there's so many people with type 2 diabetes, right? Mm-hmm. Now, they are completely different things, right? One's autoimmune and the other is usually not, right? Or it's never. And, you know, because of that, and if you think about the numbers too, right? Like, I think there's close to 35 million people in the United States with type 2 diabetes. It's roughly 10% of the population. there's less than 3 million or just about 3 million people with type 1 diabetes, which is less than 1%, right? So the majority of people, when they come in contact with somebody with diabetes, it's type 2 diabetes, right? Like, and a lot of people have somebody in their family that, has type 2 diabetes and stuff like that. And because of that, a lot of people think that like a kid, just needs to exercise more, right? Or is just lazy and is not taking care of themselves, not eating right, right? So there's like that stigma, and because of that, there's like, if think about it, if you're an administrator, right, and that's your view of diabetes type, and you think that the kid with type 1 diabetes who is asking to have food and drink whenever he wants, right? If that's your view of diabetes, you're gonna be like, no, why, you shouldn't be having food and drink, right? Like, and that's like, it kind of like it feeds that problem. It's more education. And honestly, I mean, it's you can't really blame people, because I mean, I've met nurses that don't know the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and it's so much more common than you think. Like, I know so many people in the medical field that don't know the difference. When you go through nursing school, it's like a few hours that they spend on this, and most of the time is spent on type 2 diabetes. Same thing with medical school, like you're spending a day or something on it, and unless you go into the endocrinology field, you're not going to really learn much more about it. So you're right. It's a big education thing.
Yeah, I also think along with that stigma, personally, when I look at someone who has type 1 diabetes, unless they are very, very, very high or very low and cannot function, to the regular person's eye, they look like a normal person. They don't look like there's anything wrong with them necessarily. So I think that also ties in with both of it. And I think it kind of made it seem to the administration that his situation was less extreme than it actually really was.
I brought up the wheelchair example before. Somebody in a wheelchair, that's like a visible disability. And type 1 diabetes is completely not. Myself, for instance, mine is extremely well controlled. My A1Cs are never really above 5.5. So I don't have many issues going on. I do like the off the grid loop. Like I've been looping my Omnipod and my Dexcom for a long time. So you don't know, because I'm using my phone. There's no Omnipod PDM or anything like that, unless, if I'm out at a pool or the beach or something and you see like Dexcom sensor or the Omnipod, you're gonna have no idea. You have absolutely no idea that I have type 1 diabetes. So you're right. If all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, I'm like about to faint, right? Like I need like candy, like someone's gonna be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I want to tell you, though, before we go on to the next topic, the thing about that case that I really liked was that it made a ton of new case law that protects the type 1 diabetes community at the motion to dismiss level. So the three main things that it did was it enabled an avenue for people with type 1 diabetes, or it really strengthened it. Like, it hadn't been done with a type 1 diabetes case before. It created this pathway for people with type 1 diabetes to hold schools accountable for failing to accommodate without having to go through a whole slew of administrative remedies. By the way, the school is still fighting this. Like, we're at a different motion level. We're now in summary judgment, but they really feel that these administrative remedies, which are like hearings at a district level and a state level with like an independent hearing officer. So you usually have to exhaust those before bringing a complaint, unless the accommodation that you're looking for doesn't affect your free appropriate public education. If it affects your education, then you have to follow these administrative remedies. So, my argument was that denying this kid access to his cell phone is not something that affects his educational performance. If you go to a public library and you're told you can't bring your medical device in, you have a claim against them. It doesn't have to do with your education. So the court agreed. So that was the first area. The second area was the ability to hold school administrators responsible personally for not accommodating a child with diabetes. So prior to that, what typically happens is you hold the school accountable, right? But the school indemnifies those administrators. They're protected by something called qualified immunity. So unless they do something that is so egregious that it like gets rid of that protective veil over them, all you can do is hold the school accountable. Now, this is important because you cannot obtain punitive damages from a public school district. So the only avenue here for punitive damages would be against people personally. But you have to get over that hump of holding them responsible by piercing that protective veil over them and getting around qualified immunity. So there's a law It's usually referred to as a 1983 claim, but it's coded as like 42 USC 1983. And what it allows is holding people personally responsible for discriminating on the basis of a constitutional right. The conduct by the school administrators was personal and intentional. And because of that, they should be held responsible personally, and we should be entitled to punitive damages. And the court agreed. And it's very big because it's very difficult to get around that qualified immunity. And if you think about it, it can also be applied to other public officials. So, again, the probation officer, same thing in this case. That's also huge, right? Think about, police officers, fire departments, any public official can be held responsible for not accommodating somebody with diabetes. So, I mean, that's absolutely huge. And the last time I looked, so that was in the Eastern District of New York in U.S. District Court. And the last I saw, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out in California recently cited the case in one of their decisions. So it's now binding case law all over the Ninth Circuit and in various district courts around the Northeast too. So it's huge.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting story. It's good to know. Wow.
Diabetes laws, like the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act, they're not as protective as some of the other civil rights laws. Typically you can't get punitive damages. It's difficult to hold people really responsible, right? So, there's a public bus going by and they don't have a wheelchair ramp for you to get on, and you have to get a cab or something. What are your damages, right? Like the cab fare, right? $25, $30 or something, maybe $50 if you had to get a private car, and you're going to bring a claim over $50, right? So it's like, if you can't get punitive damages, it's very difficult to hold people responsible. So I think the discrimination laws that affect disabilities are weak in that respect. The New York City human rights laws, it's one of the strongest in the country, because if there's liability for you discriminating against somebody, you have an avenue to seek punitive damages. So one thing I would like to see is an amendment to the ADA or the Rehabilitation Act or something that allows a stronger avenue for damages. That would be nice to see. I don't know if we'll ever see that, but it would be nice.
So what can I do, or what can other people do to can we sign petitions for that to happen? What is kind of the steps that we can all take to actually get this passed?
Something that JDRF does a lot of is the Children's Congress and stuff, but most of the time they're seeking money. JDRF gets funding from Congress through that bill, and so they use Children's Congress to do that every year. But what I think are two areas that people can do something in is you get people to sign a petition or something, or bring this to a senator or somebody who would be interested in adding a protection that mirrored like the New York City human rights law, right? I think you would see a ton of protection come from that, because it really doesn't just affect people with diabetes, it's other things too, right? So I think that's a potential area. Also, I mean, it's not the federal government, but like New York State, right? Like if New York State passed legislation or amended the New York State human rights law to add similar protections that the New York City human rights law has, I think that would be big too. So, and you may see other states follow suit after that, potentially. I don't know, but.
Yeah. Okay, to kind of segue, I have a personal experience that I encountered at the beginning of the summer. It's way less extreme than the one you just mentioned, but it's something that kind of opened my eyes to want to really do this interview and really made me want to know my rights. So it was after my prom. We did this separate event. It was in New York City. I walked into this place and I was being patted down by this bouncer, and obviously I have to have my insulin pump on me. I have the T-Slim, so it's more of it's a bigger device. And I also wear the site that connects that and my CGM, my Dexcom as well. And I was wearing a dress at the time, so it was a little bit tighter against my body. So as I was being patted down, she kind of was like, "What is this?" And I kind of explained to her calmly. I was like, "This is my insulin pump. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I have a medical condition." I basically just said stuff like that. And she was like, "Okay, let me see it." Again, very calmly, I was like, "I can't really take this out. I would have to pull up my dress to show you these." And then she was like, "Okay, step to the side." After some more people went by, she turned to me and she was like, "Whatever it is, we could get through it. Come on, you show me." And at that point, I felt very embarrassed, very humiliated. It was in front of a lot of people. And at that point, I just started to break down and cry. So she got the EMT that was working there. The EMT kind of took me into the bathroom, and then there I was able to show her. But even then, like, I felt very, very, very uncomfortable with the whole situation, and she definitely did not address that right. So, and she was starting to like tug at my medical devices too. So yeah.
It's kind of the same issue that a lot of people have dealt with like the TSA, right? They've gotten better over the last couple of years, but not really. I've had so many instances where I've almost missed flights because they're so concerned about like the Omnipod or somebody like trying to touch it or pull on it and things like that. I mean, I've gotten in like all out fights with like TSA agents in like different states. It's absolutely insane. The problem though is that there's this like overall bigger issue that hurts us in those situations, especially with everything that's going on these days, right? Like there's like the whole security concern, right? There's so many people doing so many crazy things that everybody's on guard now. And so like, what is this thing? And like, they get a little freaked out. And I don't think it's intentional always. I don't think anybody's like looking to harm anybody. But I mean, like you felt very unhappy, I'm sure very vulnerable, and not like, it just shouldn't have happened. It's a hard issue to navigate because it's like, at the end of the day, we're in a tough position because it's going to be hard to hold them accountable when, they have this overall, overarching concern about keeping other people safe, right? And, maybe they've seen devices that look similar that were actually, problems or something like that, right? And it's like, it's just a whole, that's a very tough issue to navigate. It shows you too, because nobody's successfully done it with TSA either. Like it's been, I mean, even to this day, right? If you go through X-ray machines at the airport, right, they'll typically ask you, and this is better than it used to be, but they'll ask you to pat down the Omnipod, and then they test your hands for like gunshot residue or like bomb residue or whatever they're testing for there. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, you can't tell me that I'm the only person with diabetes and an Omnipod that walked through here. Like, really? So it's crazy.
And I know, especially with my pump, just to be on the safe side, on the website it says that I can go through metal detectors, but I can't go through that machine that kind of like takes a whole X-ray body of yourself, of like, yeah. So I normally opt out of the test. Luckily for me, like I really have had no problems with that. I mean, yes, I have to test my hands, and I understand now with like the safety concerns, but I can definitely see how people get defensive, and sometimes they feel as though they know more than you because in that instance they're on like a higher authority. So yeah, I think advocacy for yourself and kind of remaining calm and wearing your medical ID, I think that's very big too. So you can kind of show them.
Oh, that definitely helps. I had an issue once. Actually, I had an issue a bunch of times. So the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York is very strict about electronic devices, even for lawyers. If you have a case going on, you need like, special permission from the judge to bring in electronic devices outside of just like your phone, right? And so I'm there once. I'm there on a case that is ironically was actually involving somebody with type 1 diabetes. Like I was actually there for a similar type of issue. And I had my phone and I had the old little PDM thing that they used to have for the Omnipod, right? So I go through and I'm explaining to the U.S. Marshal, who they protect the federal courthouses, that it's a medical device, right? And we ended up yelling at each other. Like there was actually yelling going on with him telling me that his wife has type 1 diabetes and he's never seen anything like this before. And me being like, well, your wife needs to like upgrade her, her stuff because like, I'm sorry, like, you don't have right. And I mean, it went on for like 10 minutes. There was a supervisor that had to come down and let him know that it was okay. And I mean, it was like absurd. I mean, like, you got to be kidding me. Like, not only am I a lawyer, but you're treating me like you're yelling at me in the middle of like of a courthouse. Like, you got to be kidding me.
And there's also more than one type of pump or CGM.
So that's part of the problem. There's so many treatments out there, right? You have 10 people who are all doing different things, right? Like I'm on Omnipod, you're on a T-Slim, somebody else may be on a Medtronic device, right? So that person might be doing pens, it's like, it's crazy. And it's good because there's so much technology out there, but it's like, we keep bringing up the education component, right? Like it's hard, It's also an issue with the schools too, because school nurses are used to one way. And then a new student comes in who has type 1 diabetes who has a different way, and they don't like the different way.
Yeah.
It's a big issue.
So on the topic of school nurses, when I was first diagnosed, I was actually in 4th grade. My school nurse really didn't know that much about type 1 diabetes. It really had to be like my family like educating her about what I had to do, my doctor kind of emailing and writing out this whole protocol, like when I need to test my blood sugar, when I need to do anything I needed to do. So in the beginning, few months of school, I actually would go down to the nurse just to get comfortable so I didn't feel embarrassed testing in front of my classmates because, you know, people are young, they kind of just say whatever. I didn't want to be embarrassed like that. But then eventually, once I got more comfortable and once I kind of knew what I was doing on my own, I wanted to start doing it in the classroom because I did end up missing valuable class time. And then that school nurse told me that I actually had to keep leaving class to test my blood sugar. And then that became a problem with my doctor, had to get involved. And, you know, sometimes school nurses think that they know better, but you have to really like be your own advocate. And at the end of the day, like, you know your body best, you know what you're ready to do. So you need to speak up for yourself and, again, know your rights and know what you're entitled to do.
Yep. And just let you know, they're not allowed to make you leave the classroom to test your blood sugar or even take insulin injections. They are not allowed to make you leave the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
People don't know that.
Yeah. So have you had any cases with someone trying to get a job and then be denied for having type 1 diabetes?
So I haven't taken any myself. I've referred some. I think the majority of the cases that I've been involved with that have that situation are in the medical field, actually. I've seen it happen a lot with nurses, surprisingly. I'm not really sure why. To be honest with you, from what I've seen, the healthcare industry is the least accommodating industry for people with disabilities. It's amazing to me. And so I have been contacted by quite a few people. And again, I've referred most of these out. Some have been in Jersey, some have been in Florida, some have been in I think one in California too. They've been like denied a position or terminated because of needing accommodations while they're employed. And it's crazy. I mean, I haven't followed through to see what the outcome was, but yeah, I've seen that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because now I'm going to be going into college and eventually then entering the workplace myself. So if someone were to like deny me a position, how do I know it's necessarily because of my diabetes?
That's the tough part. So there's two things, right? Let's say you're not employed and you're not hired, right? It's so easy to find a reason why that isn't a disability. And it's very difficult then for you to prove that your claim is because you have diabetes. Now, there's circumstances that you can go into, right? Or that you can highlight that may make it like, clear that you may have been, but it's still a very uphill battle, right? Because all the employer needs to say is that, you didn't meet their qualifications or what they were looking for. And I mean, it's easy too, right? They could just say, well, we don't think that she's a good fit for the culture here, right? I mean, that's a perfectly valid reason not to hire somebody. So it's very difficult to bring a claim like that. People do, and I'll get into how you do that in a second, but it's a little difficult. It is easier when you're already employed and you're not given a promotion or you're terminated, right? But a lot of times the employer is not going to not create some paper trail of a different issue, right? Maybe you've been tardy a couple times, like maybe your reviews weren't perfect, right? And then once they do that, it's again, you still have such an uphill battle. The employment stuff is pretty difficult.
So do you recommend when being interviewed for a job to kind of straight off the bat just kind of say, look, like I have type 1 diabetes, or do you think it's better to wait?
I think it's better to wait.
Okay.
So also understand the job you're applying for, right? Like if you're going for a job in an office, who needs to know really? There's not really going to be an issue that's affecting like if you're on an assembly line, that's a completely different story, right? Like if you get low, you're going to need to stop your work on the assembly line. If you're in construction, you're in an industry where it requires you to do a lot of manual labor, like you might need to like stop to take more breaks than somebody else. But if you're in an office, it's not really a big deal. Know the industry you're going into too. The other thing is once you're in, let's say you start and day 2, you tell them you have type 1 diabetes. That's like the perfect time because you've already been hired and there's not enough of a trail of bad performance for them to terminate you. So it's like that's the perfect time, if you want to tell them at all. I mean, I don't really bring mine up that often. Obviously, people who work with me probably know, but otherwise, like, it's not really such a big issue. I mean, most people here know that I have my foundation, so they know that I'm connected to it somehow. But that shouldn't be like the thing that's like defining about you.
That's interesting and really good to know, because that does make sense, because you can't really do anything wrong the second day you're hired. So that's really good to know.
If you are in a job and you are terminated and you think it's because you have type 1 diabetes, there's a process you have to follow. And the first step that you take is typically within 180 days of that discrimination, you have to file a complaint with the EEOC, which is the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so what they do then is they look into the incident. They'll get statements from both sides, and they will eventually issue some type of determination, which will be in the form of something called a right to sue letter. If they find that nothing happened, then you won't receive that letter. If they can't come to a determination, or they determine that something did happen, they'll issue the right to sue letter, and then you can go to court. So that's the process if you're discriminated against in employment. And I will say too, with employment discrimination, you go to the EEOC, but also with discrimination in schools, or if it's a private company like a camp or something like that, there are resources out there. And I refer a lot of people to these resources that are free and run by the government, and you can file complaints for free. One of them is the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So I refer people to them when there's a school issue, and they will investigate it, and they will either mediate on your behalf or, kind of do something, on behalf of the United States government. Not on behalf of you, but you're still the person filing the complaint with them. That's a good area because it's no cost, and it's usually quicker, right? If you end up in litigation, it could be years and a lot of money. So that's the benefit of using them. Also, the U.S. Department of Justice has a civil rights division. And so that's like a good spot to file complaints if it's against like a camp or a private school or something like that. Those are two very good resources.
Yeah, when you mentioned a camp, I've actually been to 2 diabetic sleepaway camps, which I found really good in kind of making connections and also opening my own eyes. Now I know like pretty much every pump, like Omnipod, Medtronic, like that's another thing that really helped. And again, those camps kind of are built for type 1 diabetics, so they do know those rights and do really know what people need.
Which 2 did you go to?
I went to Clara Barton Camp, which is the girls' camp, and I also went to Camp Najeta in New Jersey.
I spoke at Camp Najeta a couple years ago. They have an adult weekend, and they invited me to host a workshop on the rights of people with diabetes in employment. So I got to see the camp. I mean, I've never been myself to any of them, but it was cool to see what goes on there.
It's such a great organization. That's so awesome. That's crazy how that both happened. So do athletes, whether it be in high school or college or professional athletes, have certain accommodations while playing?
So that's a difficult area. The short answer is yes, but also not really. Okay, so if you're in high school, let's say, and you're playing on a team, you may be entitled to accommodations to deal with your diabetes during games and stuff like that. You can't be prevented from being on the team because of your diabetes, because the sports teams at schools are an extension of the school. So any school activities, whether it be before school, after school, or during school, if you're involved in them, you are entitled to reasonable accommodations. Okay. So that may be like, having the athletic trainer at all of the games that you are involved in or something like that. When you get to higher levels, it's a little different. Okay. So things that I can think of that you are entitled to are having a trainer around more often, right? Like, when I played in college, there was, the trainer was more involved with like monitoring my diabetes, right? If you get into like needing to stop games and stuff like that, you're not going to have that right. That becomes unreasonable, especially if you're talking about pro sports and things like that. You're not going to be able to stop an NFL game for someone to treat their low blood sugar. It's just not going to happen. So yeah, the short answer is like yes and no. So it depends on the circumstances, and it depends on, again, what's reasonable, You have to remember, it's the same rules that apply to like your office workspace. If you're a professional athlete, you're entitled to reasonable accommodations. But again, like if you've noticed, reasonableness is the thing that will determine whether or not you're entitled to the accommodations or not. So it's not across the board, you're entitled to, do whatever. It really depends on whether or not the accommodation is reasonable. Also, there is a requirement that you be able to do the functions of the job with those reasonable accommodations. If having an accommodation to test your blood sugar is still not going to enable you to do the job, you're not entitled to have the job. There might be some jobs that you might not be entitled to have, right? If you think about it, there's been an issue with commercial transportation, right? Because you're responsible for loads of people on a plane or a bus or something like that, or a train, right? And even with your accommodations, are you putting those people in jeopardy by having diabetes? And that's been a big thing. Like people with type 1 diabetes are not allowed to have commercial airline licenses. So God forbid you're landing a plane with, 250 people on it and your blood sugar gets low and you run off the runway, right? Like there are bigger issues than you being able to have that job. So again, it's all about reasonableness.
Going back to being an athlete, something reasonable consists of like being pulled out of the game for a short period of time, right? Stuff like that, like being subbed out until you're better, but stopping the entire game is not reasonable, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're able to be subbed out for a brief time, right? Like think about baseball, right? You can't necessarily come out of the game and go back in. Once you're out, you're out. So it depends on the sport. Also, think about it, if you're a tennis player, it's like one-on-one matches, right? You can't just like stop the match all the time, every 10 minutes if you're dealing with a lot of lows that day. So it's a little tough. I mean, look, at the same time, right? Like if you have the flu, the match is going to be canceled, right? Like it's really the same concept. It's not, just because you have diabetes, it doesn't make it like a different issue, right? It's the same, if you're sick, you're sick. Like there's things that have to happen then,
Yeah. Is there a difference between private and public schools when it comes to school accommodations?
Yes. So there are issues that affect private schools a little differently, right? So generally speaking, unless the school receives some type of public money, and it can be from state government, federal government, whatever, if it receives public money, then they're going to be bound by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. If they don't, then they may still be responsible for accommodating people with disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I believe it's Title III, if I remember right. I mentioned before, those two laws really mirror each other and they both pretty much say the same thing. So you're still protected. However, there are certain schools that are exempt, and one of them is a religious institution. If you are a religious school that doesn't accept any public money, you're not required to accommodate a person with a disability. That's just the way it is. It's a religious exemption. And so that may be an area where you don't have any right to accommodations. The other thing is that at least in New York State, the way it works with private schools is the public school is still the one responsible for providing the accommodations, believe it or not. So there's a certain provision in the New York State education law that requires the public school to pay for and provide the accommodations for you at private school. And the reason is you pay taxes to your public school district so that if you were there, you'd be entitled to these accommodations. So if you're at a school by your choosing that's private, you're still paying for those same services. So typically the process will be that you have your 504 meetings and stuff with the public school, and the private school will be a participant in those meetings. And, there'll be like a three-way kind of agreement as to like what accommodations you're entitled to, how they're going to be implemented. If it's like a one-on-one aid, right? Who's going to hire the aid? Is it going to be the private school and the public school pays for it? Or is the public school going to send one of their aides over to the private school, right? So it could be a bunch of different situations, but it doesn't mean you're not entitled to accommodations. It's just a bunch of different issues to navigate.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that now. Thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I really find everything you said very valuable, and it will definitely stick with me throughout my life. I know everyone else watching this definitely feels the same. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.